All right. Um, as I shared yesterday, JavaScript is first, object focused, not class focused. We're not defining classes like in these files. We don't have to do it that way. We can build objects just like on the fly, very dynamically, which is super flexible and kind of cool. So how do we construct an object in JavaScript? I'm going to show you a couple different ways for object construction. So objects can be constructed in a couple of ways. One is a lot more common than the other. Properties, this is the cool part. Properties can be added to objects after construction, okay? So this is going to be a big change for us. We're used to having to define an entire class with all the instance variables and all the methods, and that's not how things work in JavaScript. So we're just going to do a simple example to wrap up for today. We are going to create an empty object with the object constructor syntax. So we can say let journal entry equals new object. That looks a lot like Java. We use like the new operator. We say we want a new object, kind of like it's a class type of thing. So that's pretty familiar. I don't think I've ever seen a line of JavaScript that looks like that. No one makes JavaScript objects that way. Instead, what they do is they create an empty object. It doesn't have to be empty, but let's create empty objects first with what's called the object literal syntax. And it looks like this. Journal entry equals open and close curly bracket. That creates an empty object, an object with no properties yet. And we can always add properties later. Here's what I think is super cool about JavaScript. We can create an object with properties, and the properties, think of them as key value pairs. So like a dictionary in Python or like a map in Java, and we can use the JSON format. In addition, objects may contain methods, okay? So let's see, this will be our last example for today. So I could say journal entry equals, start with an open curly bracket. First property is date, followed by a colon. And then my date is going to be 2024-11-12, comma. Next property is going to be a habit of mind. We're going to eventually build a habit of mind journal app. Our habit of mind today is applying past knowledge to new situations. That's literally what we're doing right now. I can have a property called content. And I'm going to say, you can type whatever you want here. You can type something shorter if you want here. By comparing and contrasting JavaScript objects to Java objects, I am strengthening my understanding. Look at that. Contrasting. And then we can throw a method in here, get length. What's get length going to do? We just define the method right here. We just say return this.content.length. This refers to the object similar to Java. So let's log a bunch of stuff. Console.log. Let's log journal entry. Let's log type of journal entry. And let's actually invoke the getLength method and log that too. All right, this is a great place to stop for today. Before we start writing some more code together, I wanted to take a step back because it's been a couple of days and have some general information on objects in JavaScript. Um, so objects in JavaScript may be defined using JSON notation. Think of it as almost like an object literal. You can define all your properties and all your stuff, um, which is super convenient. Objects in JSON are key value pairs. So the key is like the property name, and then it has an associated value with it. The values can be primitive values, like we went through a couple of days ago. Values of a property could be a function. It could be references to other objects. So it's very flexible in terms of what these values can be. You can attempt to access properties in a JavaScript object that don't exist. That doesn't generate like a compiler error because there's no compiler, but it also doesn't generate a runtime error. You just get an undefined value. And sometimes that's really useful because you can add properties later. So you don't have to fully define an object up front, which is great. All right, so a lot of flexibility with objects in JavaScript. Um, I like that. So I wanted to make sure you're aware the slide exists. Again, you can see all of these linked in our Canvas module. Um, this is like our standard JSON format, and I want to explain a little bit about JSON now because we're going to be seeing more and more of it. Different symbols mean different things. So starting up at the top there, the square bracket. The square bracket represents the start of an array, the start of a list. Okay. So we can define a list of things in a JSON file. This could be the value of a property, for example. It could also be like um, other things, but usually a value of a property. So the start of the array is a square bracket. The end of the array is a square bracket. We're used to thinking about square brackets like arrays in Java, right? So that fits pretty well. Um, for the start and end of an object, it's a curly bracket like we saw a couple days ago. So a curly bracket says, here's the start of an object definition, and here's the end of the object definition. And so when we define an object, the key is the name here. Think of this as most similar to our instance variable. It's followed by a colon, and then the value follows that. So name here has a string value of charged up. Year here has a number value of 2023. Properties are separated by a comma. Um, our formatter will automatically add a comma after the last property, the last key value pair as well, which looks a little weird, but it's fine. It's valid JSON. Objects in an array are separated by a comma as well. That's consistent with what we're used to with like array literals in Java. So here is an example of like a JSON file. Shows us an array, shows us an object, shows us keys, shows us values, all of the things. So this can be a good reference to go back to if you're defining an object or creating your own JSON file. Well, so in this case, like this is like a partial JSON file, right? Like this array could be assigned to a property of some object. Let's say the name of that property was games. We use dot notation, which we'll see later today. We'd be like games dot name, or no, I'm sorry, games brackets 0 for the first element dot name would return charged up. Games bracket 0 dot year would return 2023. So that's how we navigate our way through the array, the objects, the properties, all the things. All right. So let's do more examples just like this, like accessors and things like what does that look like, which is a great question. So we left off in objects. We were focused on object construction. We saw how we could say new object, but no one does that. We could see how we can create an empty object. Lots of people do that. We could see how we can create an object literal with all the values. This is very helpful at times. And then we logged all these different things like what's journal entry. We saw how it printed everything out nicely. What's the type of it? It's an object. and then actually invoking the function defined as part of the object. So all of that good stuff. So there's really just a couple more topics I want to touch on in objects that we didn't have time for. And the first one directly relates to the question of like, how do we access these things? So it's all about accessing properties. So let's see an example of that, which I think will answer all of that. We use what's called the dot notation. Dot notation. This is like just like in Java. This is what we do in Java, right? If you have an object that has an instance variable that reference another object that has an instance variable and they're all public, you can do like, name dot, and just keep stringing it along. Um, However, one difference is non-existent properties return undefined. So let's see some examples for that. Here is our variable journal entry. It refers to this object. We have property date, habit of mind content, and the function get length. So we can access things by saying like console.log journal entry dot date. Okay, this is what I mean by using the dot notation here. If we were to do console.log journal entry dot student name, predict in your own head what will this log to the console, this last line, and then go ahead, right click on object and choose run to test your prediction. Here's the date, and student name is just undefined. Doesn't crash, no exception. It just returns undefined, which is sometimes really convenient. As I mentioned, and this is a good point to have this example, properties can be added to objects after construction. That's okay. So we could now do journal entry dot student name equals Schmidt. You can put your own name here. And then if I copy and paste this line of code, now here it will still print undefined, but then I've defined it. And so here it will print Schmidt or your name or whatever you type in your example. So we can incrementally build out an object, and we can rely on the fact that if a property doesn't exist, we get undefined, and that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we use JavaScript objects. Very, very handy. All right. The last thing I want to show you is an important connection back to Java. And this is fairly common across programming languages. It just shows up in different ways, but it's the concept of an object reference. So in my opinion, this is one of the more challenging topics in AP Computer Science A, and it shows up over and over again throughout that course. The good news is all of that like conceptual understanding you've developed in terms of the subtlety and the complexity of object references, it all applies in JavaScript too. This is great. So variables of type object have a value that is a reference to the object. Like in Java, this is great. Just like Java, we're familiar with it. So a couple of reminders then. What that means is copying an object reference is not the same as copying the object, just like in Java, This is JavaScript specific. You can use object.assign and structured clone to clone objects. Okay. Cloning objects is not something that we got into with Java. There is a clonable interface, that you can use to clone an object. By cloning an object, I mean you get a new object whose values of all of its instance variables are equal to, but not the same reference as the original object. Okay. Not really something that we focus on in APCSA or software engineering. There's a lot of complexities with that. Like what happens when objects reference other objects? Do you do a shallow clone? Do you do a deep clone? Like it's not straightforward. Um, Java's just like Java has the clonable interface, JavaScript has object assign and a structured clone. We're not going to really get into it in JavaScript either. Depending on like where your project takes you next semester, this is something that you may need to deal with and worry about. And if so, we'll deal with it then. But it doesn't come up a lot. I just want you to be familiar with this behavior and connect it back to your understanding of Java. So let's see an example of this. If I create a variable called new journal entry and I assign it the value of journal entry, and then let's say I say new journal entry dot date equals 2024. What's today's date? 14th. So I'm assigning date to, well, changing the value of the date property for new journal entry. And then if I log journal entry dot date, not new journal entry dot date, what I want you to do is complete this comment with a prediction of what this will log to the console. And once you type it in your code, turn to your neighbor and compare predictions and discuss it for like the next 30 seconds, and then we'll check what actually happens. All right, let's run it and see if our predictions are right. Run this code. All right. It printed the 14th, not the 12th. Okay. So originally we assigned the 12th here, but because new journal entry and journal entry both reference the same object, there's only one object here. When we change the date property of the object referenced by new journal entry, that's the same object that's referenced by journal entry. And so that's why this prints 2024 11/14. So potentially confusing. Good news, just like Java.